Want to do something kind of fun? I do. So why don't you do this? Go or pause the video, go grab a pen or a pencil and a sheet of paper, and then when you've got those things, come back, unpause, and we'll rock and roll. Seriously, go get those things now. All right. So we've lost our minds, right? We're in this position where we have a choice. We can conclude that we're purely physical things, meat machines, meat puppets, and like all physical things in the universe, we are subject to the natural laws of the universe, the physical laws of the universe. And this has implications for things like free will and decisions. It has implications for what we think of as our personality and whether or not ethics is possible, which assumes free will. And a lot of folks, maybe they're fine with that. Maybe they're fine with being, this just meat. On the other hand, there are going to be some folks who are uncomfortable with that idea, and they want to believe that there is some non-material aspect to themselves, that there's some soul or some non-physical self that actually exists. But they also know that wanting that to be true doesn't necessarily make it true. And so we're looking for good reasons to believe that's true, or at least the best reasons we can find. And I gave you a couple of arguments that lead to opposite conclusions. And this is just sort of one tool that we're going to start using in this mind-body problem to see if we can resolve it for ourselves. Now, what's interesting about this argument that I gave, or both of these arguments, is that the first premise of each argument relies on a kind of assumption. Right? So let's look at this first one. If human beings possess a non-material self or soul, then human beings will experience themselves as more than just a material being of flesh, blood, and bone. So the assumption here is that if we were in possession of some kind of a non-material self or soul, that we would have some experience of it. And that experience of this non-material thing would be different. It would be distinct in quality from our experience of our physical bodies. Okay? So the assumption here is that if this thing existed, we would have some experience of it. And the experience of it would have to be fundamentally distinct or fundamentally different from the experience of our physical selves, because it's the opposite of our physical selves. It would be a non-physical part of ourself. And you can sort of see a similar kind of assumption built into this argument here on the right-hand side of the screen. It says, if human beings experience themselves as more than just their material flesh, blood, and bone, and electrochemical, then they must have some non-material self or soul. Okay, and so the assumption here is that if we have an experience that seems to be greater than the sum total of our physical parts, then that must mean that there's more than just our physical parts. Okay? And so that's what we have to figure out is that true? Would the properties of a non-material thing and the experience of that thing be different from our experience of the physical properties we possess? So this is what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you to create a little list. So the first thing I need you to do is to create these three categories, A1, A2, A3. Okay? So on your piece of paper, write those down. And then I'm going to ask you to pause the video here in a second, because I want you to, for A1, I want you to think of two objects. Okay, I give you some examples of quarters, books, grass. You think of two more of your own. Okay, in A2, I want you to think of two physical descriptors. I gave you as examples green, heavy, and wet. In A3, we want two physical locations or positions or motions. I gave you jumping, talking, and across the yard. Okay, so pause the video, come up with your two examples for each category, and then when you're ready to rock and roll, unpause the video, and we'll take the next step. All right, so now let's create one more list. B1, B2, B3, write them down. In B1, I want you to come up with a couple of mental contents, and I'm thinking of things like hopes, doubts, ideas, thoughts. I'll stop so I don't take any of yours. Okay? And then in category B2, I want you to come up with a couple of mind descriptors. I gave you skeptical, clever, intelligent. Think about how you would describe the minds of, your parents or your children and your friends or siblings, people with kind of distinct minds or personalities. And then for B3, We want 2 mental activity descriptors. I gave you thinking, guessing, hoping, okay? So again, pause the video, write these things down, and really do this because it is kind of interesting to see what you come up with. And then when you're ready to rock and roll, restart the video. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. We are going to take one of the items from A2 and then have it followed up by one of the items in B1 and have it followed up by one of the items in A3, and we'll see what we get. When I did it, I have a smelly fears swirling. Kind of odd. I wish I knew what you came up with. Now let's try this. Take one of the items from B2, one of the items from B3, and one of the items from A1, and see what you come up with. I came up with confused, fantasizing skateboards. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, what seems to be happening is that the properties that we would associate with mental contents or mental events seem fundamentally different, distinct from the properties that physical things possess. The properties that mental events possess, they don't really seem to apply to physical things except in a very metaphoric sense, right? So this is how you can kind of do this to create really interesting song lyrics like I Am the Walrus or Beck's Loser. We have these combinations of concepts that don't seem to fit really well together. And so that might point us to a philosophic concept called the principle of non-identity of discernibles, okay? And that's really just a fancy way of saying things. If 2 things do not have exactly the identical properties, then they're not identical, okay? They might be highly, highly similar. Like you can take twins. They share a tremendous amount of similarity, but they're not identical. Even though we call them identical twins, all we're really saying is they look really similar. Like they look really, really similar. But if you've ever known twins, they don't look exactly the same. You're going to find individual features that distinguish them from one another. So they're not really exactly the same. Okay? Same thing. I think these women, I don't even know if that's the right word to use. You've probably seen they share a body. And I'm saying they. One interesting philosophic question is, are they the same person or are they different people? Even though they share all aspects of their identities from the neck down, they have separate heads. And so even though, these folks really share a lot. They literally share a body, except they don't share their heads. So they're not exactly the same. So this is a really important principle when we come back to this question of, do you have a mind? Well, if physical events and mental events seem to be distinctly different from one another, maybe that's an indication that the physical part of you is not generating the mental part of you, or it's distinct from the mental part of you. So then you come back to this argument and you think to yourself about this assumption that's built into the first premise of each one of these. It seems to be the case that mental things are different from physical things. Mental events are different, don't have the same properties as physical things. And so maybe that helps us resolve this argument by affirming that yes, the first 2 premises rely on a valid assumption. And that is that if this soul or non-material self actually exists, I'm going to have an experience of myself that's different. It's discernible from my experience of my physical self. Or the other assumption, if I have some sort of an experience of myself that is discernibly distinct from my physical body, then that must mean I have a non-material self or soul.